Hello, this is Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest. Welcome to another episode of Three Questions. Sorry to have skipped one during the Thanksgiving holiday period, but now back on track and determined to stay that way. I'm very pleased to have with me today my Center for the National Interest colleague, Andy Kuchins, who is a senior fellow here at the center, where he's working on Central Asia and Russia and a number of other things. And Andy has really a very long and distinguished background as an expert on Russia here and at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he ran the former Carnegie Moscow Center, and doing too many other things for me to list in a 15-minute podcast episode, but all very impressive and I think someone highly respected by his colleagues. So, Andy, thank you very much for being with me today.
Hey, it's a great pleasure and privilege to be with you, Paul.
We're going to talk today more about Russia and Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And I've done a number of episodes on that recently. And I guess I'm a little sorry to inflict that on everybody, but it is an area of enduring personal interest. And actually, there's been a lot going on. I think 2 weeks from now, we will try to get back onto technology and energy and some other things. We'll take a little break from Russia. But for today, there's actually a lot to talk about. We have this sort of ongoing U.S., Russia, Ukraine negotiating process. I'm a little bit hesitant to call it a process because I'm not sure that it's necessarily that structured, but there is sort of an effort underway on President Trump's part and, being implemented by some kind of key administration officials and also now even the presidential son-in-law, Jared Kushner, getting involved in all of this. So I guess, my first question for you, Andy, up to three questions, is there kind of finally a chance that we'll see some kind of a peace deal in Ukraine? Is all of this for real?
I think there's definitely a chance, Paul. I wouldn't want to put a percentage chance on it, and I don't think that it's going to happen, before the end of this year, certainly. But these efforts, which go back to President Trump's beginning of the outreach back in February, one, it's impressive that he stayed at it this long. But recent developments look more promising. I think the meeting last week in Moscow was quite telling in several respects. One, from the Trump side, the inclusion of Jared Kushner that you alluded to is very important. And both the Ukrainians look at that as a positive. They don't see Kushner as being as pro-Russian as Steve Witkoff appears to be in his remarks. And the Russians also, in their way, expressed their respect for Kushner. I've started a new podcast at the center, Russia Decoded, and we did a fair amount of reporting in the most recent edition that came out a couple of days ago. And there was one interesting moment, Paul, where, the Russian news, they often, very, very often use Western sources to kind of make the point that they want to make. They kind of understand that even their own domestic audience is very skeptical of the Russian propaganda and the Kremlin line. So there was a segment in which was a video from CNN. I don't know when, and well, it's fairly recent, of course, because this gentleman said that, well, I'm pleased that Jared Kushner is now joining the negotiations because he is not as pro-Russian as Steve Witkoff. He has not drunk the Kremlin Kool-Aid, basically. And this was broadcast on Russian news and rebroadcast on their Sunday news program. So the inclusion of Kushner is a very, I think, significant development. And also they referred to his experience with the Abraham Accords 5 years ago, and more recently with Israel. The other thing that I think is a significant tell is the fact that Vladimir Putin spent 5 hours in this meeting. He's a busy guy, and for him to allocate so much time for this suggests that he is looking at this very seriously. He always keeps his cards close to his chest, but to me that was a positive sign. And then there was the readout afterwards from their former ambassador to the United States, Yuri Ushakov, whom we know well, that was referring to the point you made at the outset, Paul, that the Russians want to see this go into a more traditional process of a which is serious negotiation for a conflict like this needs. That also was positive. Now, of course, this is all from the Russian side, but the consultations with Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been going along steadily. The three critical issues for them to work out that I don't think are agreed to at this point is just exactly what kind of territorial concession are we talking about? And two, the issue of security guarantees, a concept that I'm generally very skeptical of, but it is a critical part of this negotiation. And then the third piece, and this is where this really gets to the European piece, are what's to be done with the Russian central bank reserves, the majority of which are being held by Euroclear, which is a Belgian institution. And the EU has been trying to devise an innovative, creative way to be able to use these funds because Ukraine is looking at a huge budget deficit in the next couple of years of 45 to 50 billion dollars. And the Europeans, while they've been very generous, as have we, that is not a number that they want to contend with, and they definitely would like to be able to use that. But so far, the Belgians, for a number of reasons, have been reluctant to do that. So progress. When this war started, 2022, no way. 2023, no way. 2024, no way. 2025, maybe they start some progress, but there it is.
Thank you for that, Andy. And I guess since you brought up the security guarantees, I'll just observe briefly on that. And this is a comment, not one of my limited supply of three questions, but just as a comment, I would kind of observe that I think the discussion about security guarantees often becomes a little bit of a distraction in the sense that I mean, I understand full well why Ukraine would want that, and I think there's sort of important public relations value to it, and maybe a little bit of psychological deterrent value to it. But ultimately, Ukraine had sort of zero security guarantees from the United States or from NATO or from any European government. And look at everything that has been done to help Ukraine because, American and European officials have viewed it as being in the interest of their countries to do that. I think they've acted in this way because of their sense of their interests. And if they have the same view of their interests in the future, I think they can be expected to do something pretty similar in the future if the need arose. And conversely, if they no longer viewed it as being in their interest, the fact that somebody had signed something, I think would not really be a major obstacle to not helping. There's definitely a political element to that. I'm sure domestically for Zelensky internally, it's really valuable and everything. But I think it's also useful to have a sense of perspective on that. That's sort of my 2 cents. But so anyway, let's sort of move on to question number 2 here. And here, let's sort of take the hypothetical. Let's say there is in 2026, some kind of a settlement that Russia and Ukraine are both willing to accept, with presumably some amount of American pressure and cajoling involved. And the Europeans also decide to go along with that, probably for lack of a better alternative in that scenario. How do you see Putin's post-war goals in a scenario like that one? Is he sort of preparing for round two, in the way that I think many fear, and as soon as he has enough tanks and missiles and everything else built again, he tries to take the rest of Ukraine or to invade NATO members or something like that? Or maybe something more mild than that? I hate this term of hybrid warfare, which I think is sort of overused and underexplained, but there could be another view of, short of invading, of, political interference in Europe and harassment of various kinds, etc. Or do they just kind of focus on putting their country back together, to include resettling people in eastern Ukraine who left that region and went to Russia, and rebuilding, God knows how many schools and hospitals and roads and airports and everything else. And they sort of leave everybody else alone for a little while.
My view is on that is, I don't know if it's contrarian, but it's more optimistic, I suppose, than a lot of the analysis that I read. It's very striking to me, the level of war hysteria that is evident in Europe. I think it's at a higher level than it ever was during the Cold War. Actually, one, I think, just kind of also partly in response to the first question, I think it's exceedingly in the interests of Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States that this war come to an end as soon as possible. The Ukrainians have obviously suffered the most, and their recovery is going to take a long time. It's going to be very expensive. But the Russians have also suffered tremendously. I mean, they have taken over 1 million casualties for, frankly, not that much real estate that they have taken in the last nearly 4 years. Paul, in January at some point, one day in January, this war with Ukraine will be longer than the war with Germany in World War II. That's a striking thing. So,
Sorry to interrupt, in a situation in which the Soviet Union actually was able, at the
yes.
end of that war, to drive all the way across Europe, to Berlin.
Exactly. They did take a lot of territory. It was very impressive, and it's the furthest west that the Russian Empire in its Tsarist period or the Soviet period ever got. But I mean, look how little territory they've taken 4 years in 4 years, and look at the cost. I think more broadly, Russia has never been so isolated from the West as it is today in its entire history. The famous double-headed eagle that looks east and west. Well, Russia is now so over-leveraged to China and has so reduced its options and its alternatives. I mean, the fact that Gazprom gave up about a 160-70 billion dollars of revenue a year that they lost with the exports to Europe, it's mind-boggling. Thane Gustafson, old friend of ours and professor at Georgetown, has come out with a new book entitled Perfect Storm. I'm about halfway through it, but he documents the level of integration that took place between the United States, Europe, and Russia up to 2022, and it's extraordinary. Russia has walked away from this. The long-term costs for Russia are exceedingly high from these 4 years. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago, and it was about Russia, basically how much Russia has fallen behind in the race for AI. And there was the video that kind of said everything. Their first humanoid robot had been demonstrated about a month ago in Moscow, took a couple of stumbling steps and literally fell on its face. I thought that was a great metaphor for what Russia has given up. So, I mean, the opportunity to rebalance their foreign policy, it just makes so much sense for them. On the other hand, these, we'll just call them hybrid warfare activities, for lack of a better term. I mean, they go back to 2006 and 2007, with the CDOS attacks, the cyber attacks in Estonia, when they were pissed off that the
Right.
Estonians pulled down a statue. And so, the Nashi starting to hassle the British ambassador. This has been going on for almost 20 years, even at a time while the tremendous economic integration was going on. I'm a little skeptical that all of that unwinds. For me, Paul, what I see this war representing is the total failure on the part of Russia, on the part of Europe, and a part of the United States. I'll leave Ukraine out of it, but to develop a sustainable security architecture in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's just been an utter fail. I think it's so much in all of our interests that we have an opportunity. You never get a fresh start, but to kind of take a crack at this again, and you can't do that until there is resolution of this war.
Yeah, to the extent that anything positive can come out of this whole horrific experience, one hopes that it might be something like that. Although obviously not very easy, really, at all. So again, sort of pursuing the hypothetical here that maybe there is some kind of a deal. What do you think should be U.S. strategy at that point moving forward? I mean, Russia, I think I agree with you, has a strong interest in rebalancing its foreign policy. Is there going to be is there going to be anybody at the other end, who wants to engage with them in doing something like that? I mean, the Europeans you described, having this almost sense of hysteria. And, I have a similar feeling myself that there's really very, very great fear that there could be like a continent-wide, war with Russia kind of at any time. The U.S., perhaps there's some receptivity to that on the part of the president and his administration. It seems like the rest of American society might be sort of lukewarm at best where something like that is concerned. And if you are like running a public company, for example, what are you going to be like willing to do actually in Russia or with Russia or whatever? What do you think the American approach should be if we manage to get to kind of a post-settlement, post-war situation with Russia?
I think, for one, we need to stop dissing Europe. Kind of the J.D. Vance line articulated back in February, which is kind of accented in the new security strategy released that week. It really represents a coalescence of Putin's view of the Europeans as feckless, as a huge obstacle actually to the resolution of the war. I mean, they get described on Russian TV as the Европейские поджигатели, the European arsonists, who are just pouring gasoline on the fire. I mean, I think it would be incredibly foolish for the United States to dissolve NATO. And I think there are naturally increasing fears of that. And I think that actually the Russians should be concerned about this. The main reason to me why I am less fearful of a Russian attack on a NATO member is because of nuclear deterrence. The war in Ukraine doesn't, immediately, raise the nuclear question as would some attack on a Baltic states or any other member of NATO. I think the Russians would beware of what you wish for. I mean, Putin doesn't like NATO. We know that. They don't like the expansion of membership. They didn't like the expansion of mission, maybe even more. But if the Europeans are left on their own, I think that would be a less stable situation for the Russians. At any rate, so one would be get away from that line and let's get lined up with our European allies. Yes, Europe has a lot of problems with weak leadership over there and a stagnant economy and an overregulated economy. So that's one. I think one easy place for us to start with the Russians is actually on nuclear security. That's always been a good one for the U.S. Soviet relationship and the U.S. post Soviet relationship. And it's something that accords Russia the level of respect that it thinks it deserves as a great power. And that's an exceedingly important aspect to the Russian mentality. And only the United States can provide that for Russians. And that's a piece of leverage that I think Donald Trump has actually in these negotiations over the Russo-Ukrainian war. But, I thought it was very smart on Putin's part that he took the initiative and proposed discussions on the extension of the START II treaty, which is to expire quite soon. And that would be kind of almost the last piece of the nuclear architecture that took 60 years or so to build up. If you start with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty back in 1963 after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I would say that's low hanging fruit. There's not going to be any magic bonanza that's going to happen immediately with the resolution of the war. And I think you were implying this with your framing of the question. Actually, if you look at the integration of economic integration began in the Soviet period on the European side and the American side back in the early 1970s. So what Putin, threw into the toilet beginning in 2014 and then conclusively in 2022 with the full-on war, that had taken, 50 years to build up. And I think it was actually a remarkable success story after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, I think companies and banks are going to be wary of jumping. I mean, the Russia risk is going to remain high for an extended period of time.
Thanks a lot, Andy. I'm offering sort of more commentary here than I often do.
Well, you know a lot about this topic.
Well, I mean, you're sort of saying, I think, a lot of interesting things, and let me just offer as sort of a closing thought here. There's this view, which is very widespread, I think, that Putin is some kind of deep strategic genius. I think your point about sort of be careful what you wish for. I think Putin has really actually over and over again failed on precisely that point because he has sort of these ideas about things that he wants or needs and tries to get them. And then it turns out actually to have been a really huge mistake. And I had the view for a long time, actually, that he was really obsessed with, trying to prevent Ukraine from becoming a NATO member. I mean, I understand why Russia would view that as not being in its interest and everything else. But the way that Putin pursued that objective, which could have been pursued in other ways,
At far less cost.
at far less cost, and it was extremely counterproductive. And in 2014, part of the intent was to be sending that message and trying to prevent that from happening. But what 2014 actually did, and for the listeners here, I'm talking about Russia's seizure of Crimea and then the beginning of its intervention in eastern Ukraine. What 2014 did was, yes, it kind of put a public stake in the heart of Ukraine's NATO membership, but it opened the floodgates on bilateral defense relationships with Ukraine that didn't exist before
Absolutely.
and didn't have to exist, and created, I think, the very dynamic that I think contributed to Putin's decision in 2022, which also turned out to be sort of be careful what you wish for in a lot of respects, because it was very poorly planned and executed, et cetera, et cetera. And this idea of like dividing Europe from the United States or dividing Europe internally, which you mentioned, and this is what sort of got me onto this line. I mean, I think that's also, I think if any of our Russian friends are listening, I encourage you to think that one through a little bit more carefully, actually, because, consequence number one of splitting the US from the Europeans is that the Europeans have to find some way to build a lot more nuclear missiles.
That's right.
Uh,
And there will be
and
that it increases the likelihood of proliferation of
yeah,
nuclear
right,
powers in
right.
Europe.
And that's way worse for Russia, because those are nuclear missiles that, you don't have like a 30-minute warning time. You have a very short warning time. So if I were our Russian friends, I would think kind of long and hard about that one. And where Europe itself is concerned, Europe today, you have sort of kind of some governments that are more hostile to Russia, others that are less so. And they're all working together to find sort of a consensus position. And if you break that apart, sure, NATO won't do this or that. The EU won't do this or that. But you may have like 6, 7, 8, 9 really ardently hostile governments that are no longer constrained by the need to maintain consensus. So I'm kind of not sure that that's such a hot idea.
I think we're
Actually,
both pretty sure it's a pretty bad idea.
well, nobody elected me president of Russia. I don't really plan on running for the job. But I have to say that's one that I would also think pretty carefully about, because I'm not sure that it actually ends well for Russia.
Just a quick comment. I completely agree with what you just said, that this decision on Putin's part back, especially in 2022, where he threw all the marbles on the table, was a colossal strategic blunder. I thought on February 24th, 2022, my first reaction was, oh my God, Putin is going to be destroying two countries simultaneously in different ways. I didn't see that either of them had the capacity to achieve military goals that they articulated. If you'd asked me if it would be a 4-year war of attrition, I might have been a little skeptical of that. But
Yeah.
I also didn't see how they would be able to unwind it. And that was day one. All of those
Hmm.
thoughts hit
Hmm.
me. And
Right.
here we are. And just to get back to your first question and what we've both said, yes, this is an incredibly challenging task to pull this off. But I think that there's a reasonable chance of success, but I'm not going to put any money on it.
I certainly hope for Ukraine's sake that there's kind of an acceptable way to bring all of this to an end sooner rather than later. And I think it's better for the Russian people also. Thank you so much again for those listening. Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest, Three Questions podcast. I'm here with my colleague, Andy Kuchins, a senior fellow at the center. Thank you for listening today, and hope you're back with us again soon.
Thank you. Bye bye.